Senator Cormann.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Madam Acting Deputy President, today we're debating yet another tax from a high-taxing, high-spending, wasteful Labor government. We're debating an increase in income tax rates for all Australians earning more than $50,000, unless they qualify for the specific exemption. So why do we have to debate this tax? We have to debate this tax because after 3 years of Labor waste and mismanagement, our public finances are in such bad shape that, faced with an unexpected disaster, the government feels they have no choice than to whack on another tax. Let's be absolutely clear, Madam Acting Deputy President. If it hadn't been for the Prime Minister's waste and mismanagement as Minister for Education with her school halls programme, if it hadn't been for the waste and mismanagement with the Pink Bats programme, and with one programme after the other being maladministered by this Labor administration, then there would be no need for this latest income tax hike. This is, of course, the latest in a long list of new Labor taxes. Currently, we're debating the flood tax, the mining tax, the carbon tax, student taxes, which of course come after the Alcopops tax, the luxury car tax increase, the tax on the North West Shelf, gas projects, a whole plethora of new and increased taxes introduced under the last 3 years of the Labor government. In fact, over the last 3 years, more than $40 billion in new or increased taxes have been introduced by this government. And this government has so lost touch with the Australian people, they don't even know a tax when they fall over one. The Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Minister for Finance, again and again went out there in Radio Land, in 7:30 Report Land, or in news, and Meet the Press and so on, and claim $40 billion worth of new and increased taxes as what? As savings, Madam Acting Deputy President. This government thinks that when they whack another tax on to the Australian people, they're actually saving money. No doubt that's because this government thinks that all the money is the government's money, and that the government, through its largesse, makes a decision as to how much they allow people to keep. So this government thinks, this Labor government thinks, that whenever they whack on another tax on the unsuspecting Australian public, that they save some money for the government. It's a disgrace, Madam Acting Deputy President, and just to put it very squarely on the record, the Coalition stands for lower taxes. The Coalition stands for fairer and simpler taxes. And the Coalition does not support this latest increase in the income tax rates applying to people across Australia. In 2007, this government inherited a budget that was in very good shape, Madam Acting Deputy President. No government net debt, a $20 billion surplus, a $60 billion worth of investment in the future fund, money put away for a rainy day. And what have we got now? We had deficit after deficit. We've got, as I mentioned, $40 billion worth of new and increased taxes and $94 billion worth of government net debt. And yet still, this government can't find $1.8 billion to help fund the reconstruction effort in Queensland. A reconstruction effort, of course, that is very important. A reconstruction effort that, of course, is supported by the Coalition. A reconstruction effort that should be able to be funded without having to go back to the Australian people in this ad hoc fashion, whacking yet another tax onto them. And, of course, the Coalition has taken a very constructive, a very bipartisan approach to this. We have offered to the government to sit down with the government and find the necessary savings. But, of course, that offer was not taken up. Madam Acting Deputy President, whenever this government is faced with a challenge, whenever this government is faced with a problem, their first response, their first instinct is to go for another tax. This government never makes the tough decision. This government doesn't do what is required to keep our public finances in healthy shape. Because if this government, of course, had its finances in order, there would be no need for this tax. But I just talk a little about the reconstruction effort. The Treasury tells us that current estimates are that the Commonwealth contribution to the reconstruction effort will be roughly, $5.6 billion. That was an estimate identified before Cyclone Yasi. So, chances are it's going to be quite a bit more. So, of course, we've asked the government, given that chances are that your exposure is going to be quite a bit more than the $5.6 billion, what are you going to do if you haven't got enough money? Are you going to whack on another tax? Are you going to increase it by more? Is the tax going to run for longer, the tax in this bill? No, we were told. There's no way we would do that. And of course the Australian people know that they can trust this government when they say that there won't be another tax. There won't be a carbon tax under the government I lead, the Prime Minister said. And of course we know what happened to this. So we were a bit suspicious as to how credible these commitments were. But here we are. The government says, no, we're not going to increase this tax any further. We're not going to make it run any longer. We're just going to save some more money. We're going to cut some more spending. Well, if you can cut some more spending down the track, if the expenditure is going to be more, why can't you do it now? I mean, in 2 months' time, we're going to have a budget. You can take a strategic approach to all of this. If you can make some more savings now, why don't you do it now? And why don't you look at your revenue and spending commitments holistically at the time of the budget in 2 months? $350 billion worth, the Commonwealth budget, and you can't find $2 out of 350 to help fund the reconstruction effort in Queensland, the necessary reconstruction effort in Queensland. This government is a joke, Madam Acting Deputy President. They're completely reckless when it comes to the management of public finances, and that is, of course, the reason why this government nearly lost the election on 21 August last year and was only able to scrape back in with the support of 2 Conservative independents from New South Wales. Now, and what a precedent this sets. Every time we're going to have a natural disaster, is the government going to come out and say, well, let's have another tax? We're going to have the bushfire tax and the flood tax and whatever tax, you name it. Senator Perry, you're quite right. And I mean, the ingenuity and the creativity of this government to come up with ever new taxes knows no end. So why did the government not wait until budget time? Why did they come up with this legislation now? Why did they announce it so quickly? Because there's one thing that drives this government, and that is the politics of getting away with introducing yet another tax. This government is addicted to new taxes. But they also know that taxes are unpopular. They know that the Australian people have a lot of goodwill and generosity towards the people of Queensland, towards the reconstruction effort. So this government thought they'd take advantage of that. This government thought they'd strike while the iron is hot. This government thought no better time to come up with a new tax than the present. This is the time to come up with a tax because people across Australia are going to let us get away with it. And let's call it a flat levy. Let's call it a mateship tax. Let's give it a nice cuddly name and people will be happy about it. But of course the Australian people aren't that stupid. They can see through this government. They've seen it again and again. When they were given supposedly high moral ground reasons to introduce another tax, then Madam Acting Deputy President, you would well remember the alcopops tax, which was supposed to reduce binge drinking, which was supposed to reduce the consumption of alcopops, at the same time while Treasury was counting on an increase in the consumption of alcopops. This is the sort of track record this government has when it comes to tax. They see an opportunity to get away with it and they go through it. That's what happens with this government, Madam Acting Deputy President. Now, the reality is Australians had been donating generously. When Australians witness a tragedy like the one in Queensland, people are very, very generous, and Australians have dug deep. But of course, after they've dug deep, in comes the government and whacks them with this tax. What do you think is going to happen when the next disaster comes around the corner? As it sadly but inevitably will. Do you think that the Australian people will be a bit more circumspect, a bit more cautious before they spend as much as they can possibly afford to support their fellow Australians at a time of need? No, because they will expect that this government will do as it has done before, and it will whack them with yet another so-called emergency, so-called mateship tax. Now, the government supposedly made a whole series of savings. But of course, hundreds of millions of those savings were reversed. Like to get the vote of the Greens, to get the vote of Mr. Wilkie, to get the vote of Senator Fielding. They haven't quite got the vote of Senator Xenophon yet, as I understand it, but like they've been spending money left, right and centre, reversing savings, reversing spending cuts. Have they identified, this government, any new spending cuts? No, they haven't. So what do they say to us when we ask, well, what's going to happen? Wait for the budget. We're going to organise all of that in the context of the budget. Well, if you can organise those spending cuts in the context of the budget, why can't you organise the $1.8 billion worth of spending cuts that would be required in order not to have this tax as an ad hoc tax? Why would you not wait for the budget before proceeding with this? And there is no reasonable explanation for this from anyone in government. Talking about strategic, remember the Henry Tax Review, Madam Acting Deputy President. The Henry Tax Review was supposed to be this root and branch reform of our tax system, delivering a fairer and simpler tax system. The only thing, of course, that we've ended up with out of that particular review was a multi-billion-dollar new tax, which was negotiated in private with 3 taxpayers, excluding all of their competitors from the process, as well as state and territory governments and all other stakeholders and the public at large. But of course, then we were told, after the Prime Minister nearly lost the election, but was saved by Mr. Oakeshott and Mr. Windsor, we were told we were going to have a tax summit. We were going to have a fair dinkum tax summit by 30 June 2011 this year. And in that tax summit, we were going to throw open all of the recommendations of the Henry Tax Review, and there was going to be a strategic look at the taxation arrangements in this country. Not this continuation of ad hoc tax grabs, one after the other, but a strategic look at what the taxation arrangements in the context of our spending commitments for Australia would need to be. And is that going to happen? No, Madam Acting Deputy President. The promise by the Prime Minister, very quickly made when she was desperate to get their support to form a minority Labor government, that promise is about to be broken. Treasury Secretary Ken Henry let the cat out of the bag. I don't think he quite knew what he was doing when he quoted the Prime Minister saying that it wouldn't be happening before 30 June. But of course we'd been hearing similar rumours. The Treasurer Wayne Swan doesn't want to have a strategic look at the tax system. He wants to continue to go ahead with tax grab after tax grab after tax grab like this one without being bothered by any strategic and serious reform assessment of what the taxation needs are of Australia. He doesn't want to be bothered by these sorts of strategic assessments in his pursuit of more and more money for this high-spending, wasteful Labor government. And so here we are. We've got yet another Labor tax grab outside of any strategic context, which in our judgment is not in the public interest. And of course, in this context, I would just say to the member for Lyne and to the member for New England that they have to realise that unless they disassociate themselves from these sorts of Labor failures, these failures will also be their failures. Now, we actually had a debate in Senate estimates as to whether this was a tax. Senator Sherry was trying to argue, no, this is not a tax. Well, I refer Senator Sherry to the title of this bill, Income Tax Rates Amendment Bill. What do you think the Income Tax Rates Amendment Bill is going to do if it is not amending income tax rates? And let me be very clear for all Australian people. This is a bill to increase income tax for all Australians earning more than $50,000, unless they are in one of those few exemption areas. And let me talk about the exemption areas, because there's a lot of confusion about this. We looked at the Prime Minister's press release of 27 January as to who would be exempt. Those who received Australian Government disaster recovery payment for a flood event in 2010-11 will be exempt from the levy. And in the Treasury fact sheet, those who have received an Australian Government disaster recovery payment in relation to the flood event in 2011 will not have to pay the levy. So we ask the question in estimates, what about the victims of the WA bushfires. I mean, Don Randall, the very hard-working federal member for Canning, brought this to my attention. He said, you better ask some questions about this in estimates. So I did. I asked the Secretary of the Finance Department. What did he say? He confirmed exactly that. Only those that are subject to a flood event will not have to pay the levy. So we thought, oh, well, that's a matter of public interest. A lot of our constituents had approaches on this and were very concerned about it. The West Australian was about to write a story on it, so they asked a question of the Prime Minister's office. And this is what a spokesman for Ms Gillard said. Victims of this year's WA bushfires will be exempted. And I quote, as the Prime Minister has made clear, if people have been hard hit by natural disasters in the last few weeks, then it's only fair they don't pay the levy. Now that is very nice for the Prime Minister's spokesman to say that to a journalist when they're faced with a bad story on the front page of a daily newspaper. But to this day, they haven't actually adjusted the information that's out there on the Treasury website or any of the official information. To this day, it still says that you're only going to be exempt if you're subject to a flood event. So, without wanting to be disrespectful to the Prime Minister, but we don't trust the word of your spokesman under pressure in a daily newspaper in Western Australia. We want to see that commitment in writing. If it is to be the case that all Australians subject to a natural disaster are going to be exempt, then you should be clarifying this today, and you should be adjusting the relevant information on your relevant websites today. Because there have been too many broken promises, of course, by this Prime Minister for us to take anything that she just says verbally at face value, and in particular if that message is translated by one of her spin doctors in the context of a media story. Now, I do want to reflect on the approach taken to this tax by one of our colleagues in the lower house, namely the member for O'Connor. The member for O'Connor was elected on a platform to reverse the Canberra rip-off. It should now be clear to anyone that the people of O'Connor were deceived at the last election, Madam Acting Deputy President. Tony Crook is not here to reverse the rip-off. He is here helping Labor get rip-offs like this one through the Parliament.
Senator, I don't want to interrupt your flow, but you need to respond, refer to the member as Mr Cook.
But Mr Crook, the member of O'Connor, is not here to reverse the rip-off, Madam Acting Deputy President. He is here helping Labor get rip-offs like this one through the Parliament. Yet again, the new member for O'Connor stood shoulder to shoulder with the Labor Prime Minister, voting for and not against another Labor rip-off. Without the member for O'Connor, people across Australia, across Western Australia, and across O'Connor would not be hit with this additional income tax grab. Without the member for O'Connor voting for it, this tax would have been defeated in the House of Representatives. And the people of O'Connor need to understand this very clearly. Wilson Tuckey would never have voted for a rip-off like this. He stood up for O'Connor and would never have voted for a Labor Party tax grab like this one. In fact, no Liberal member for O'Connor would have voted for this rip-off. So our message to the people of O'Connor is very clearly, if you want to end Labor's rip-off moving forward, you need to vote for a change of government. And the only way to achieve a change of government, of course, is to support your Liberal candidate for O'Connor at the next election. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, if I can conclude my remarks on this latest Labor Party tax grab. It is a tax grab that comes from a desperate government that has been spending recklessly, that has wasted taxpayers' money, that has put our public finances in such bad shape that they feel they've been left with no choice other than to whack on yet another ad hoc tax. The time for ad hoc tax grabs should be over. We should be taking a strategic approach to our tax system. We should be committed to lower, fairer, simpler taxes as a parliament. The Treasurer, rather than to come in with one tax grab after the other, outside of any strategic context, should commit himself to a fair income tax summit. That was actually a serious and very important achievement that the two key independents got out of the negotiations with the government. But I'm disappointed that they're not working harder with us to ensure that this Labour government delivers on it. Because how many more ad hoc tax grabs will this government be able to put forward between now and whenever this tax summit might finally happen sometime in 2012? The Australian people deserve better. The Australian people deserve a government that doesn't whack on one tax after the other.
Thank you, Senator.